Hi, welcome back. In our last lecture, we talked about contracting systems, the system that contains the rules that we are going to use to regulate our business dealings. Now, a contract cannot exist on its own. A contract must exist within the framework of a contracting system. Now, what does a contracting system do? Well, in every contract, the parties have expectations. And contracts allow the parties a means to allocate risk so that their expectations are met. And these risks include a number of issues, which we'll talk about in a second. A contracting system provides a framework for those entering into business transactions. In our society, we have to have confidence in our contracting system because we may not trust the other person on the other end of this transaction. We may not know the person, but if we trust our contracting system, then we can enter into that relationship knowing that if something goes wrong, I can call upon the contracting system and the remedies provided by it to satisfy my expectations. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to answer the following questions. What are the expectations of a buyer? What are the expectations of a seller? And what risks do the parties to a sales transaction encounter? Let's first of all talk about expectations. And I like to start with expectations because this is the reason we enter into a contract, right? We have certain expectations. And in a contract for the sale of goods, whether it is something simple and easy, like buying a bag of chips at the university store, or buying hundreds of barrels of oil from overseas, the expectations of the parties to the contract are the same. In the smallest transaction, the smallest sales transaction, and in the largest possible sales transactions, you will find that the parties have the same expectations. Let's start with a buyer. Now, the buyer has certain expectations. The buyer wants to get the goods. And not just the goods, but they want to receive the goods that they bargained for. Those specific goods. Goods that match the description that was provided by the seller. Those are the goods the buyer wishes to receive. Now, the buyer ideally will want to confirm that the goods are satisfactory. And in the law, we call this a right to inspect, a right of inspection. And the buyer wants to be able to inspect the goods before it pays them for them. The buyer does not want to pay for the goods until it has satisfied itself that the goods are what it bargained for. Otherwise, the buyer will have paid for goods that are not the goods it ordered and for which it may not have a use. So the ultimate expectation of a buyer is to get the goods that it bargained for. Now, the seller also has expectations. What does a seller want? A seller wants to get paid, right? The seller wishes to receive payment. And not just receive payment, but expeditiously, meaning as soon as possible. The seller does not want to endure an extended waiting period while the buyer inspects. Furthermore, the seller may want to avoid shipping goods that may be rejected, because in that case it is parted with the goods but has not received payment, and it may have difficulty recovering the goods. So the seller's expectation is it wants to receive payment, it wants to be paid as quickly and as easily as possible. So in this environment, we have a tension, right? The buyer has certain expectations, the seller has certain expectations, and there can be a tension between them. The seller doesn't want to part with the goods until the buyer gives them the cash. The buyer doesn't want to pay for the goods until it has a chance to ensure itself that these goods match the description. Now, these sort of transactions, these sort of expectations can be easily met if it is a local transaction. If you are buying that bag of chips, you can look at the bag of chips before actually spending the money. And the buyer understands that it's going to receive payment before you walk out with a bag of chips. But in a distance transaction, in a transaction where the parties, the buyer and the seller, are separated by thousands of miles, we rely on contracts to enable the parties to meet those expectations. Now, contracting system, what it does is it provides the ability of the parties to allocate risks. It provides for the assignment of risks between the parties. Now, there are risks associated with performance. In fact, risks break down into two categories. The first being performance. And the greatest risk associated with performance, of course, is non-performance. In the case of a seller, non-performance is a failure to ship the goods. In the case of a buyer, non-performance is the failure to pay for the goods. So non-performance, probably the greatest risk encountered in a contract. But there are other risks associated with performance as well. For instance, late performance. If I, as a seller, sell goods with the understanding that you're going to pay for them within 30 days, and you do pay for them, but you pay for them on the 90th day after our transaction, well, what does that mean? That means I have missed out on that money for 2 months. At a minimum, you've cost me the interest that I would have earned on that money had it been sitting in a bank. But even worse, you may have cost me the ability to enter into other transactions because I was waiting for your payment. Now, for a buyer, of course, late performance can also be a problem. If you own a business that is time sensitive, for instance, you own a pop-up shop that opens at the end of August and stays open through Halloween, and you sell costumes, well, you want to have those costumes available for sale on September 1st. If those costumes are not delivered until October 15, you've lost out on most of your sales. So late performance has caused you harm. There could be unacceptable performance, which is to say, in the case of a seller, the goods do not conform to what was in the contract. Unacceptable performance. You performed, you shipped goods, but the goods weren't what you're supposed to ship. Therefore, that performance is unacceptable. Even early performance can be problematic, which is to say, if you are working on a construction site, you're building a building, and you make a contract for the provision of certain items at a certain time, if those items are sent early, well, that means that you've got to find a place to store that item because you're not ready to install it in the building. That's cost you money because now you got to pay for storage. Or maybe you don't even have storage and the part is going to sit out in the rain and get destroyed. So early performance can be a problem as well.